Hello and welcome again to Backpage. I'm Jody C. and today we're visiting with Mridula Koshy. Did I say that correctly?
Yes, you did.
Okay. She's from New Delhi originally, and she's written a collection of short stories here called If It Is Sweet. So welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Talk to me about your work.
Okay. This is my first book, and there's a couple of editions of it, which is interesting, I think, because when I wrote it, I really was thinking of where I was living, and the people I was writing for were pretty much the people who are in the book and who were around me at the time. So I was living in New Delhi. I had gone back to New Delhi, where I was born and raised, after a 20-year absence. Went back in my mid-30s, lived there for 6 years, and then came back again to Oregon recently. I started writing these short stories because the people around me were very compelling, and naturally it was sort of for me a conversation with them that I couldn't actually have, so I had it on the page, and then I hoped maybe that they would find it and read it. The result is, I think, a collection that is not always the most accessible to people outside of India, but people in India read things that are not accessible to them. People all over the world read things and understand that they're going to have bits of it that they're going to have to jump over. When I read novels, Russian novels, as a little kid, I would never read the names. I would just see the image of the name and kind of flash over it because they're so long and there were so many consonants and Rostov, Kovskov, and just kept going.
And they might, be called Nikki.
Yes.
So
yes, and it was nice when in Tolstoy she became Kitty after a while.
Yeah.
Or maybe she was right from the start but had a long, complicated last name. So the Australian edition of this book is supposed to be a friendlier edition for the Western reader, but I think it really depends on how much a reader wants to work. Sometimes readers want to work and are comfortable with not understanding everything in a piece. Something like what we were talking about with poetry earlier, before you started.
So, the title, If It Is Sweet. Usually when you see the title and you start reading, it'll show up. It'll show up. You'll see, there's the title. And I recall seeing it twice, different stories. So explain that.
Because I wrote the stories one at a time and without a collection in mind initially, and maybe about halfway through writing a few dozen stories, I was getting a few published here and there. Interestingly, in journals in Canada more than anywhere else. There are not that many literary journals in English in India right now.
But there's a large Indian population and Pakistani population in Canada. Maybe that's why.
Is.
It's really large.
Yeah, and I think Canadians are really interested in. I mean, these are large generalizations, but I think there are some places where people have a real outward-looking culture and are comfortable reading things from elsewhere, things they don't understand. I think maybe the Canadians fit that category. So when I started looking for what unites these disparate stories, there were a few obvious things, because I think anytime one person writes, it's really going to come from the limitations of who they are. And partly it's like a struggle against your limitations, but I'm very interested in class, so a lot of the stories turned out to be about class. It was the thing that struck me about India when I came back to it as an adult. I had left it as a teenager, so essentially as a child. Coming back to it as an adult, the first thing that hit me was just how stratified society was, which raised...
But it's still that way?
Yes, I think so. I mean, it was stratified when I was a child, but I just took it as children do without any sort of... I took it, I assumed this is how life is. I did not know that there is a way to look at life to try to figure out, is this how it should be? Is it different somewhere else? But I came back to that society as an adult. I saw what I saw, was very interested in understanding it better, and writing was an exercise in understanding that. So I think, the book could have had a title like Class, but that would have been horrible. But I think this question of if it is sweet and its fragmentary nature is also true for a lot of the stories, both the stories where that phrase occurs and kind of what it means to me, and hopefully it will mean different things to readers. It won't just be what I say it is, but its fragmentary nature, I think, speaks to, in my stories, I'm interested in how things don't always make a whole, and there isn't always closure.
Yeah.
And there's things hanging out there that are just as interesting to me as the idea of closure.
Yeah.
I think some writers are driven by closure and bringing things to an order. They write perhaps to seek order in the world.
Yeah.
And I'm interested not so much in disorder as not order, the places where there's actually things happening between order. So if it is sweet, I mean, it's hopefully it doesn't sound like some kind of definite thing, because it's not meant to. For me, I guess life isn't very definite, and that I set out to ask myself some questions in my writing was not an exercise in looking for answers so much as sort of amplifying the questions further.
You know, there's a writer, an American writer from Baltimore named Ann Tyler, and I love her work. But when I first started reading things that Ann Tyler would write, there was no conclusion. Nothing was ever wrapped up in a nice bow at the end of it. And that was upsetting to me, because I wanted everything, you know, resolution. But then what I finally got was that this is the way that she wrote, and so if I wanted to read what she was writing, I just have to get over it, you know, and so I did.
Maybe she wanted to upset you.
Yeah, maybe so, and she did, but she also is such a great writer that eventually I didn't care.
Yes, I think as a writer you have to give your reader some reward for engaging with you, because they can engage with their neighbor or another writer or their child. I mean, you have to make it worthwhile, and I try to work hard on my craft, because I think what I write is challenging, and it doesn't give people the satisfaction that we sometimes want from literature, the happy ending or the, yes, we're all the same. I do believe we're all the same, but I'm also interested in the idea that we're also very different from one another, and kind of the sum expression of humanity takes so many different forms, and there's more than one way to do things. How we fall in love is different in different cultures. It's different within the same culture. How men fall in love might be different from how women. So if I'm going to write a story about falling in love, I want it to be a story that looks, I'm not interested in ethnographic stories or anthropological stories, because then I'd have been an anthropologist. I would have written about customs and rituals. I'm interested in just kind of expressing the fact that these differences are out there, and what does that mean about us. So there are no conclusions. So hopefully I have a good character in there, or a good turn of phrase, so that the reader who's kind of scratching her head and feeling troubled is also simultaneously, you know, feeling a little rewarded, like it is worthwhile. Something has to be fun in the piece. It can't just all be difficult.
Hey, if you're just tuning in, I'm Jody C., and this is Backpage, and we're visiting with Mridula Koshy, who's a writer originally from India and now in Oregon. So you were in India, you were born and raised in India, came to America when you were like, what, 14?
I was close to 15, I went to high school and college here, got married to an American, had little American babies.
And then you went back?
And then all along I had said to my partner, I really want to go back, I really want to go back. And I have 3 siblings. My parents were the migrants, so we children came as part of the package. It wasn't easy. My parents came first, my mother specifically. She came when I was 8 years old. And I didn't really rejoin her till I was almost 15. So my childhood was full of this kind of longing to be with my mother, and wondering where she was, and it really, perhaps at times, and also I think at times feeling bad for myself. And when I was an adult and working as a community organizer here in Oregon, I went to a session where a gentleman, I think a migrant farm worker, spoke. It was at my church afterwards. It was part of this kind of, they called it the listening season, and we were telling each other our stories. And it was part of a political kind of organizing campaign, while simultaneously being about our faith and all of that. And listening to him for the first time, I really heard my mother's voice. And he talked about how difficult it is for him to cross that border, to come and just as difficult to cross that border to go back. When he comes, he leaves everybody, his children. But when he goes back, he knows he may not be able to come back here again, which means he's leaving his livelihood. And I don't think my mother's story was quite that, I mean, it wasn't that dramatic in the sense of it being that harrowing. Her economic situation was not as hard as his. Nevertheless, she was leaving her kids. Nevertheless, the life that she was trying to create here was something that she hoped to give us when she brought us over. And I think I stopped feeling as sorry for myself. And I started connecting with the idea that this story of mine has this other half to it, which is my parents' story, and in turn connects to this man's story and his children's. And I love that about how if you step out, you can amplify till you really see your place in the world.
So where was your mom decided to come? What
She
about
came
your father?
first. He came later.
Really?
He had a really good job in India and was settled
But he
in
was
his
okay
life.
with her leaving? Sorta?
I think there was a lot of ambivalence in the family. I imagine even in those situations where you absolutely need to do something difficult, like, you know, in the story of the gentleman who has to come here, nevertheless, there's always ambivalence. I mean, I don't think there's ever anything very conclusive about any of our experiences. You know, you do it and you have your misgivings the whole way. And there's always and what if I hadn't? And where would that have taken me? And who would I have been if I wasn't who I am today? Then you look at the people around you and say, I could have been her and him, and you know, and it's part of that connection that.
Well, and everything kind of leads to everything else. So, you know, whatever you choose and however you end up is, you have to think that it's better than what you would have, how you would have wound up if you hadn't chosen this path. You
Certainly,
know?
I mean, to find some satisfaction in life, you have to come to that conclusion.
Well, I mean, I kind of think everything's like for the highest good anyway, even if it doesn't always look that way. I could be wrong, but we'll find out.
Yeah.
So tell me what you're working on now.
My second book is just going out in review copies in India. HarperCollins India has published it, and it's a novel. So I have an Indian publisher, which was how the first book was published, and then it went to Australia. It never came here, and it was shown to publishers here, but almost uniformly I heard back that we'd love to see a novel from you. These look good, but a first book as a collection of short stories is not very easily done. It's, I think readers do want to go to the bookstore and walk away with a hefty novel, and they will read short stories from a writer they admire whose novels they've already read. So, or you know, or short stories are meant for magazines and so on. So this novel, which is coming out in India, will now hopefully find a home in the U.S. and elsewhere in the world. But I don't know that for sure. So I think of my writing life as just something I have to do separate from whether or not I do write to get published. I wouldn't want to lay too heavy a hand on the statement that I don't write. You know, I write for myself. I do, but I also write to get published. So there's this kind of dynamic and tension between the two. I do hope it will get published in the U.S., but whether it does or not, I know I have to keep writing. So that's probably what every writer who sits with you says. Well, because both are compulsions. The self and the audience are both compulsions.
You want to, when you write, you want to get it published. You want to get paid to do it because it takes up a lot of time and energy. You know, so it's not like that's not there.
Well,
it is
from
there.
the practical matter of a livelihood too, I think really I understand myself by talking to people and figuring out who they are, and then figuring out what they're figuring out about me in that whole circle. So with writing, I'm really not sure what my stories are till they find readers. And it's really not about reading the review copy or not the review copy, but the review, reading the review and going, oh, he liked it, that must be a good story. I don't mean in that simplistic sense, but more sort of, I think there is an ongoing conversation in all of our societies, and it's about who we are. And my writing is an attempt to join that conversation. And obviously, as with any conversation, there has to be back and forth. So I write, and then I read things other people write. I hear what readers are saying and thinking, and their response to things that they're reading, not just my book, but other books. That whole literature conversation, that the whole who are we thing.
You know, there's a guy in Salem named Geronimo Tagatak. He's a very fine writer, and he's a short story writer. I had him on the show a few years ago, and I said to him, I said, these short stories are so interesting, and you ever think about just taking one of the stories and running with it and making a whole novel out of it? And he went, oh, I don't know. And I said, well, you know, why do you write short stories? You know, why is it that way? And he said, I've just never been able to write anything longer than 27 pages. Well, it's nice to know your limitations.
Yeah. When I was pregnant with my kids, I gained the same amount of weight each time. So that's and I kind of came to some conclusion about that, or had an understanding about that. Like, that's who I am. That's what I'm made to do physiologically. Because I actually ate very differently, and I had a very stressed first pregnancy. I was working 60-hour weeks. Second pregnancy, I was home with the first baby, had my second child, gained exactly the same amount of weight, eating healthy, and so on. I think when I have a story to tell, it already has a shape and a size to it. And I notice when I write short stories, they're always about 4,500 to 7,000 words. I would love to write a 1,500 word short story, because then it would be easier to get published in those. Most journals are asking for shorter and shorter. I cannot do flash fiction. So this gentleman, Geronimo, maybe he has a similar makeup.
It could be.
Yeah, a kind of a size that we are, that we bring into our, or a weight we carry with us.
Yeah.
The novel, I had a story to tell, and only once the short stories were out did I feel like I had the freedom to engage for 3 years with a project and not know if it was going to be a successful one or not. Because that's a lot of freedom to give yourself. I have responsibilities in the world. Who am I to take 3 years of life to kind of write something and then go, well, that didn't work. You know, with a short story, I felt like I was taking a month for a story, and if it didn't work, I could put it away for a year and maybe even get a second shot at it a year later. And if it didn't work altogether, that was fine too. There were other stories. And so when this book came out, I was able to sit down and say to myself, I have a book. I now have permission to write a big book.
So tell me the story about the novel that you're working on.
Well, I told you a little bit about autobiographically. I mean, my parents having to leave the way they left, and living without them for kind of a length of time in my childhood. I ended up writing a novel in which a mother relinquishes her 4-year-old son. You know, the first 4 years she's struggling to keep him, and there's a lot of pressure on her. She's an unwed mother in a traditional society in South India, in a state called Kerala, and which is where my parents are from. I was raised in Delhi, which is very cosmopolitan and very different. In fact, Kerala is historically a very cosmopolitan place. When we talk about the spice route, and when the Romans went looking for pepper, it was Kerala. It was the Malabar coast that they were talking about. So lots of people, the Greeks, everybody landed at one time or other there, and the Malayalis have gone all over the world. That's the people from Kerala. But at the same time, it's actually quite a traditional and sometimes conflictingly parochial society. So this mother has this experience of being told, no, you cannot have this child. And 4 years into it, she gives them up. And 40 years later, we visit both of them. So the first half of the book is set in Kerala, and the second half is set in the United States, where he is a man, and he has been adopted by an American family. So it's also a book, I mean, it's a book about two societies. It's a book about motherhood and loss. And it's also, I think, a book about adoption as an institution. I always have, in my writing, been very interested in the mechanical workings of society, not just the who are we, big human philosophical question, but how do we then act out our conclusions about who we are? And we have decided that, you know, this is one way to look at the question of difficult parenting or difficult children. Sometimes it's a parent who suffers from an illness, has maybe alcoholism is in the picture. Okay, well, does this child need to be removed? How do we look at that? I mean, what rights does the parent have? What rights does the child have? What about the rights of a mother who maybe has infertility as an issue that she wants to address through adoption? Who is she when she comes into this picture? So in the adoption community, they talk about the triangle: the biological parent, the adoptive parent, and the child. Mm-hmm. And the way the triangle is set up right now, it is the adoptive parent who has the most rights, and the biological parent and the child come lower down in that. So what does that say about us, and is this how we should do it? Mm-hmm. That's really a lot of what I get at in this novel.
Well, you mentioned earlier when we first sat down to begin talking about coming here as a teenager, coming to America as a teenager, and how difficult that was.
Yeah.
And that was in the 80s?
Yes, I came in the late 80s. No, mid-80s.
Mid-80s, okay.
To Los Angeles.
Okay. So, and you were 14, and then, but when your son went to India and came back to America, it was a much easier time.
Yeah, he did have a better.
What's the difference, do you suppose?
I thought so hard about this, and maybe there's good books and stories in this thinking that I've been doing. I was amazed at how well he did. He came back to Portland, which he had left as a 7-year-old. He came back as a 14-year-old, and I have 2 other children also, but they were younger. So, and his experience was very significant to me because it mirrored, or it paralleled mine. It didn't end up mirroring it. It was his own experience. Mm-hmm. He walked into a school in Northeast Portland where we live, and Humboldt Elementary School, and was welcomed. And of course, there was the first 2 weeks where he didn't know people, and they kind of poked him a bit, and he might have poked them back. I don't know, but within weeks, he was so integrated into the classroom. My experience was all through high school, which I did 3 years of high school in Los Angeles, in a rather large school. I had great difficulty, and it was at a time when the community we moved into, the suburban community we moved into, was seeing a huge influx of immigration. Mm-hmm. And California in the mid to late 80s was like a tinderbox.
Yeah.
There were people going out to the border with Mexico and holding up mirrors to shine a light on the border, and it was to reflect the spotlights to make it so lit up that it would be hard for people who were crossing illegally. So these kind of citizen vigilante actions, plus organized political movements. There was an English-only movement, which included, they wanted to strip Chinatown of its signs. We're in a different world now. We have the president we have, and kind of an understanding about the changes that have occurred in this country over the last 2 decades since I first came. An understanding that is maybe embracing some of those changes and feeling good about the fact that this is who we are as Americans. This is a good thing about us, that we struggled and we've come to this other place. And I think earlier when we were talking, we were also talking about change, and change is always happening. Change just keeps changing, and really it's a question of which way and how. We cannot stay still, and having a determining voice in which way we're going to change has always been very important to me. Another reason I write, and why my writing sometimes is quite political. I look at my son's life and I think some very nice things have happened here, and I feel very good about it.
Isn't that a good feeling?
Yeah. As a mother, to be able to put your child in a world and not feel like it's a bad world is because you have to leave them. You have to leave the planet, and they have to live for another 40, 50, 60 years without you, and then raise their children. Right. You want to be able to say, "Whew, it's all right. He'll be fine.
He'll be fine." Yeah. So how was it for you? When you came to America, what was the hard part when you were 14 or 15 years old? Were people unkind to you? Or?
Yeah, but it was, the unkindness is, because you go home and your parents are kind to you, and you can make it up there. Some people are always unkind, and some people, the hardest thing for me was I became politicized very quickly. I was on the school newspaper. I mean, this is the great thing about life here, is that you can experience one set of things, and also probably about life anywhere, you can also experience another set of things. So on the one hand, as I walked in, I was told, oh, no one could understand my English. Maybe a little bit they still can't, I don't know. I have an accent still 20 years into it, 25 years into it. But they couldn't understand me, and they said that meant I couldn't take the kinds of classes that would have put me on a college track. So our high school was very big, some 2,000 plus students, and there was the bungalows after you crossed the track and the football field way out there, where the kids who weren't going anywhere were sent. So I went there.
Oh.
And
Just because you had an accent?
among other things, I mean, my parents were not very good at, because they didn't understand the system, at going in and advocating. So most of the things that I do with my son, they didn't do with me. They didn't come to parent-teacher conferences. And I went into the counselor's office and said, I would like to take science and math. And he said, well, you know, third world science is different. So you have to start here. And so I started from back. And in my second year of high school, my English teacher said, you don't belong here. And she happened to teach the AP, the college prep track, and I just jumped right over to that. And those sorts of experiences are, I think, the more institutional ways in which what an individual may express as unkindness can then be translated into an institutional approach. And I call that institutional racism, and I experienced a lot of it in high school.
Wow.
I felt like, as I was preparing for the SATs, I did have a teacher who said to me, really, your parents are very poor, aren't they? Are you sure you want to spend the $50 to take, because you have to send $50 in for your application? And, you know, I did really well on the achievements in the SATs and
So
went
did you
on
go
to college.
Did you do
I
that
wanted to, but yeah, it was, personally in life, I'm a little bit of a coward.
Yeah.
And I do a lot of nice with people.
Yeah.
I love writing because I don't have to be nice in my
Atta
writing.
girl. Well, listen, they're giving me the high sign, so we're going to have to wrap it up. But we've been talking with Mridula Koshy about her book, If It Is Sweet, which you can order where?
It's the Indian edition is available on Amazon. I think the Australian edition might be, but it's also available at Elliott Bay Bookstore in Seattle.
Okay.
It's the one bookstore in the U.S. that's carrying me right now.
Anyway, I'm Jody C. This program is Backpage. We thank you for joining us. Join us again next time as we take another peek at the Backpage. And remember, we're all in this together. More the same than different. Do your best. Thank you, ma'am.